Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another edition of Budget Magic. So this week, we are doing something we have never ever done before. I've been doing Budget Magic for a year and a half now, something like that, and we have never played a Legacy deck on Budget Magic, so this week is a first for us. So basically, we're in this weird dead time in Standard, we're waiting for E3 Volt, we have a couple more weeks before E3 Volt cards come out on Magic Online, so we played a lot of Modern lately, so I figured we'll try something different this week. Don't expect Legacy to be a very regular thing because it's pretty challenging to build Legacy on a budget, but I think it's possible to build Legacy Burn for under $100. So as you can see, 99 bucks in the paper world, 133 ticks on Magic Online. That's because Eidolon of the Great Revels is way more expensive on Magic Online than it is in paper. It's like $100 a playset on Magic Online and $25 in paper. So that's why there's a weird price difference there, but we go by paper prices primarily. Normally that means Magic Online prices are actually cheaper. This is one of the weird situations where that's not true. Anyway, a quick reminder before we break it all down. If you enjoy this Legacy Burn deck and you enjoy Budget Magic in general, it would be awesome of you if you could take a quick second, click that subscribe button down in the corner of your screen. It's a great way to support the channel and the site for free. So let's talk Legacy Burn. First off, the foundation of this deck is 16 lightning bolts. So basically, the way Legacy Burn works is we are essentially a combo deck, and our combo is if we cast 6 spells over the course of the game before we die, well, resolve 6 spells over the course of the game before we die, then we win. And the reason that works is because our spells deal, on average, about 3 damage each. So that adds us up to 18 damage, opponents crack fetches, or whatever. Some of our spells do more damage. So if we cast and resolve 6 spells, we win. And the reason this plan works is we have so many lightning bolts. So a lot of these cards you know from Modern, if you're familiar with Modern Burn, literal lightning bolt, staple everywhere, the best burn spell ever. Rift Bolt in Modern as well, lightning bolt would suspend 1. Lava Spike, a lightning bolt that only hits your opponent's face. The addition for Legacy is Chain Lightning, which is essentially a sorcery speed lightning bolt. It has a bunch of other attacks. Technically an opponent can pay 2 red and copy it, and then if you have 2 red up, you can copy it again. So it chains around, but in practice, that rarely ever happens. I don't think that, I mean, it does come up in fringe situations, but it's very rare that your opponent's going to have 2 red mana up and actually chain a Chain Lightning. So it's mostly just a sorcery speed lightning bolt. So these spells, one of the key things with our deck is we want to throw them at our opponent's face. We are one of the few decks in Magic where it is correct to, on turn 1, play a mountain and just lightning bolt our opponent's face. Because, like I said, we're a combo deck, so we're not hopefully going to be using these cards to kill our opponent's creatures. We will bolt a creature in a pinch if it's gaining our opponent much of life, if it's going to kill us, but most of the time we just want to start slinging these bolts at our opponent's face every turn again and again until our opponent dies. So that's kind of the foundation of the deck. We also get a single Skullcrack, not very good. This was one of the last cards to make it into the deck, but it's reasonable. It can fizzle life gain. The problem is it's 2 mana for 3 damage, and we're just talking about our 16 cards that do 3 damage for 1 mana, so from that perspective, it's way more expensive than most of the burn spells in our deck. We do have a bunch of other 2 mana burn spells though, and some of them are pretty strong. Flame Rift is essentially a Boros Charm, 4 damage to each player, so it might seem weird that we would want to deal 4 damage to ourselves, but when you consider that our deck is built around dealing a ton of damage really fast, if we could play a card that said both players start at 16 life, we would definitely play that, Leyline of Burn, let's say, because we can take advantage of that more than our opponent can, so even though it's hurting us as well, most of the time, that's actually fine with us. Dropping both players 4 life is a benefit for us because we can back that up with more burn spells when our opponent likely cannot. Sonic Burst So it seems good. 2 mana for 4 damage is actually pretty powerful. That's on par with Flame Rift. However, it requires us to discard a card at random. So the problem with Sonic Burst is it's super bad if we get in these situations, which do happen, where we play through our entire hand, we're empty-handed, we got our opponent to like 2 life, we need 1 burn spell, any burn spell to close out the game, we're top decking, knocking the top of our deck, we peel it, it's Sonic Burst. We can't cast it because we don't have a card to discard, and we lose the game to our opponent's Tarmogoyf or whatever. So that's the exact situation where Sonic Burst is bad. Otherwise, it's a reasonable rate. It's just a one-of. That's another one that was kind of the last cards to slot into the deck when we were trying to fill out space. Price of Progress is insane. It is often 4, 6, 8 damage for 2 mana at instant speed. We play 100% Mountain, so it doesn't hurt us at all. And it also doesn't target, so having ley lines or anything like that on our opponent's side of the battlefield doesn't matter. So it's just one of our best ways to close out the game. One of the things that makes our burn deck and legacy burn decks unique is they are much, much scarier than the modern versions because we have spells that can do huge chunks of damage. If we can get our opponent to 10 over the first couple turns with our lightning bolts, it's very possible with just 2 or even 3 lands that we can just 10 our opponent out of nowhere with Price of Progress, with some other cards that we have in our deck. Speaking of other cards that make the deck scary, Fire Blast is pretty absurd. It is 4 damage for free. We just have to sack mountains. We very rarely, if we're ever hard casting this, something went very wrong. We don't want 6 lands on the battlefield, so it's in there essentially to be sack 2 mountains, deal 4 damage, and it makes our deck super scary. That's how we can, if our opponent's at 10, Lightning Bolt, we're tapped out, have only 2 lands, sack our 2 lands, 4 more damage, close out the game that way, and it's super hard to play around because it's instant speed, so we just wait till our opponent taps down or taps out. Yeah, sure, they could have 4s, it's legacy, but that plays around a lot of stuff and get in that 4 free damage to close out the game. We normally want Fire Blast to be the last spell that we cast because we're sacking our lands and we will need those lands if we're planning on the game continuing, but mostly this is the closer. We just hold on to this. Once we get our opponent to a low enough life total where Fire Blast will win the game, we look for that opportune window, slam the Fire Blast, sacking our mountains, and close things out. We also have Sulfuric Vortex, which is like the opposite of Fire Blast. So Fire Blast lets us close out the game by surprise at instant speed, and is very powerful in that sense. Sulfuric Vortex closes out the game really slowly, but it's really key against some decks. If our opponent's playing Miracles, they could get the countertop lock and counter essentially all of our spells, but if we can slip through a Sulfuric Vortex, we just ping our opponent to death 2 damage a time on their upkeep, and we don't need to fire off many more burn spells. So it just kind of sits out there and slowly wins us the game, but that's still really helpful. Plus, it keeps our opponent from gaining life, so if our opponent has a Deathrite Shaman, for example, Sulfuric Vortex is a great answer to that. As far as creatures, only 2 different ones. We have 4 Monastery Swiftspear, which is essentially a budget Goblin Guide. Although, there are some arguments that it's actually better than Goblin Guide. While it doesn't get in as much damage on turn 1, it only attacks for 1. On turn 2 or on turn 3, it's often hitting for 3 damage because we can play 2 burn spells, get 2 prowess triggers. So over the course of 2 or 3 turns, the damage output of Swiftspear often equals up to Goblin Guide. We would play Goblin Guide if we could, but it's way too expensive for the budget. And then Eidolon of the Great Revels, this is the biggest chunk of our budget, definitely on Magic Online, but in paper as well, but it's a super key card to our deck. So it's 2 damage whenever anyone casts a spell with converted mana cost 3 or less on a 2/2 body, so it's on curve. The big thing with this one is it's fine, just in any matchup. We play it, if our opponent wants to kill it, they gotta take 2 damage, maybe we get an attack in between, maybe they cast a Brainstorm in between, so we get in 4 damage. So the damage output is fine, but the key thing is, our deck is pretty fast. We can kill turn 3 with good draws, turn 4 pretty consistently. However, there's definitely decks, like Storm decks, that kill on turn 2, on turn 3 really consistently, and are a bit faster than us. However, those decks require casting a bunch of spells in the same turn, a bunch of cheap spells in the same turn, and they literally can't win through an Eidolon. If we can play an Eidolon on turn 2, it buys us at least a turn or 2 against those really fast cantrippy combo decks. That is why Eidolon is super important, because those matchups would be very close to unwinnable without Eidolon, but with Eidolon, if we have an Eidolon, they're actually pretty good matchups. Mana base wise, just 19 mountains. In the sideboard, Pyrostatic Pillar is essentially our Eidolon of the Great Revels in enchantment form. So we can go up to 8 Eidolons, essentially, if we're playing against a Storm deck, for example, and make sure we have that effect. Because like I said, that effect is so important. If we have that effect, it feels like we almost can't lose. If we don't have that effect, it feels like we almost can't win. So going up to 8 of them helps us make sure we have one of those in the matchups where it's good. Tormod Crypt fights against dredge decks, other graveyard things. Searing Blood and Pyroclasm give us some removal. Searing Blood is kind of a substitute for Searing Blaze. So one of the main things our deck is missing is fetch lands and the synergies that go with fetch lands. If we had fetch lands, we would definitely play Searing Blaze. It's 1 more damage to the creature, and we could always trigger it with landfall thanks to fetches. But since we don't have fetches, Searing Blood is just better because it's always 2 damage, hits our opponent as well. Smash to Smithereens helps against Chalice of the Void, other like Thorn of Amethyst that make spells more expensive. They can be pretty annoying for our deck to beat, and it does damage to our opponent's face. You can see kind of the theme of the sideboard is stuff that does something we need, plus goes at our opponent's face for more damage to keep furthering our primary game plan. Red Elemental Blast can get a blue spell, a Show and Tell, a Jace or something. And that is our Legacy Burn deck, and that's our Budget Magic deck for this week. So I think this deck will be pretty solid. It's actually, as far as the spells in the deck, we have a couple of weird ones, but for the most part, we're pretty on par as far as playing the best burn spells available. Like, our spells are pretty close to an ideal burn deck. We're missing a few key things, Goblin Guides, fetch lands that can be upgradable, but we're way cheaper. A typical Legacy burn deck with all the fillings is like $600, $700, so to get down to under $100, it took some doing, but our deck is still pretty solid, so I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. So I think it'll be competitive. It'll obviously depend on the matchups we run into. There's so many decks in Legacy. We could run into Chalice of the Voids and just get locked out of the game. We could run into counterbalance locks where we just can't cast spells. So I think we have the tools to beat about anyone. We're essentially a combo deck that wins consistently turn 3.5, turn 4, with a reasonable draw. So that's essentially what we are. Whether or not that's good enough depends on the matchups and all that stuff. We are missing some of the stuff that helps in specific matchups, like Ensnaring Bridge in the sideboard is a big one that's really helpful. Tormod's Crypt rather than Grafdigger's Cage makes us weaker in some matchups. So some things like that. But I think this deck is powerful enough to steal a lot of wins in Legacy for $100. The other thing I really like about this deck is if you are a modern burn player, you can easily upgrade. You already have a big chunk of this deck. You need to add in maybe $20 worth of cards to be this Legacy burn deck. And if you buy this deck for Legacy, you can easily port it over to be a modern burn deck as well. So you have the ability for not too much money to have a competitive or at least semi-competitive decks in both formats. And the upgrade path for both of them are similar. If you're going to upgrade to having a more ideal Legacy or Modern Burn deck, you're going to add fetch lands, a couple of Grim Lavamancers, Goblin Guides, and the upgrade cards that you would buy are cards that you would use for both versions. So they're actually really similar, so you kind of get a 2-for-1 by making this your Legacy deck, because you also get a Modern deck, or if you have the Modern deck, making this your Legacy deck. And while it isn't probably quite on the power level as the best decks in Legacy, those decks are like $3,000, so you really can't go wrong. If you want something that you can take to a local Legacy tournament and have a reasonable chance of succeeding with, just like this for $100, this is the way to go. And if you add in some upgrades, it gets even better. You get more cards for specific matchups to help keep you in the game. So anyway, that's our Legacy Burn Budget Magic deck. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoy the gameplay videos, and I will talk to you soon.